Hello, my name is Dr. Ron England, and this is a video from my programming series on programming fundamentals, and we're talking about loops. So let's talk about loops. What is a loop? Well, if you want to repeat something over and over again, that would be a loop. You basically want to do the same thing over and over again. Now, it doesn't make sense to do something exactly over and over again. Well, maybe it does. Who knows? Maybe you want to do the exact same thing multiple times, but you just want to count how many times that you're doing it, or you want to control how many times you're doing it. Well, there's lots of different kinds of loops. There's loops where you can do that. You can say, I want to do it X number of times and do it just X number of times. There's also loops where you can say, I want to do it until something happens, and then I want to jump out and not be doing it anymore. Well, we'll look at those, but for right now, let's look at that loop that we can count how many times we do it. So let's first, I'm going to do this in two different languages, JavaScript and Python. Both of them good languages to use, and both of them going to be kind of fun to work with. So if I hit run on this specific JavaScript example that I'm running in JS Fiddle, let's first zoom in here and look at the code. So I've decided that I'm going to do the loop with a counter. And my counter, and that, by the way, is in programming terms we call a for loop. You're counting when you're doing it. Now, we can get really complex with these counters, but for right now, let's stay simple. So the counter is going to start at 0, the counter is going to stop at 5, and just to make this so that you can kind of see how things work, I'm going to have an array called A that has A, B, C, D, E. And if you look at it, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters in it. So, okay, so this should be pretty cool. Should be able to do this. So first thing is, let's do a loop that counts up with a variable. So let's come down here and look at this. This for loop has basically 3 pieces. Where do I start? Where do I stop? And then how do I increment? Now, to do that, we actually use a counter, a variable that counts. And kind of by tradition, you usually see this variable called I think for some reason at the very beginning of programming and all the way back probably to C, somebody said, let's just call that counter I. It's just a variable. It can be any variable, but you see I a lot. So we said so this basically sets up the loop. It says, we're going to start with I equal to start, which by the way is 0. We're going to stop when I is less than stop, and we're going to use I++, which is just a way of saying I is going to count up. It's going to add something to it every single time. We can change that. We can actually have it add, in this case it's just going to add 1, but it could add something else. And then I'm just going to throw the output to the console. So let's look at the console. So here is where it says it's incrementing, and we log I, and we log the variable A of I. Now note, I being 0, A of 0 will be A. Well, that tells me something there. This variable, to access each of the elements in the array, I need to tell what number in the array it is, but the array starts at 0. Okay, well that's fine. We're good. A starts at 0, so so we have I equals 1, and A of I is B, I of 2 is C, A of I of 3 is D, and then when you get to the fourth one, well notice there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements in the array that are numbered 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And my loop, this is my loop, I told it, start at 0, stop when it's less than 5. Notice it never got to 5. I told it to stop when it was less than 5. When it got to 5, it said, no, I'm done. I'm not doing it anymore. I'm finished. Okay, so it never got to A of 5, and I went up. So that's incrementing. Okay, I also decremented. Okay, decrementing, and if I look at my decrementing in my what actually came out of doing this, here's what happened. So I console logged and said, okay, I'm decrementing. Okay, here you can see where it actually said decrementing, And now I started with I equals stop. Well, I of stop was 5. That is A of 5. But we just saw from the previous example, this is A of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. There is no A of 5. Well, guess what? If I ask JavaScript to tell me what A of 5 is, JavaScript says, hey, you haven't defined 5, it's undefined. Now, how does this usually show up to you in your program? Some error message that says, cannot use undefined as something something. Okay? And you're like, oh my gosh, I have an error. I don't know what to do. Why is it doing that? Oh my God. Well, don't panic. You probably did something just like this. A of 5 is undefined because A only goes 0 through 4. It may have 5 elements in it, but 5 doesn't exist. But JavaScript handled this quite well. It said, hey, I'm not going to throw an error message out. I may throw an error message when I try to use the undefined, but when I'm printing it or logging it to the console, I'm just going to tell you, hey, look, it's undefined. And how can you solve a lot of these? Well, they're simple. See that console log? Right there. Log it out and say, oh, it really is undefined. Well, why is it undefined? Oh, yeah, because A of 5 doesn't exist because arrays start at 0. And they don't go up to 5, even though it's got 5 elements in it. So no freaking out. But what it also did was, notice I said when it's I is greater than start, as long as I is greater than start, well, start is 0. There is an element A of 0. It's the letter A. But I never got there because I stopped before I got to that 0 because I had to be greater than. So that's another thing that might happen. So suppose you're expecting to get to that last element, but you don't. Plus, what is this for doing? Well, it says I'm going to start at the highest number. I'm going to end at the lowest number, or I'm going to end before I get to the lowest number. And this I minus minus just basically said, hey, I'm going to decrement. I'm going down. Okay, so I'm starting and I'm actually taking away 1 every time I do that, and then I console log. So should you understand this? Everything that I just covered, you need to know. This is part of programming. And this kind of needs to be ingrained because it's going to come to you slightly differently. You're not going to have this nice, clean, I can see what's happening here. Usually when you're doing a loop, you're doing a bunch of variables and equations, and it's going all over the place, and you're like, uh-oh, something didn't work. What did I do wrong? Get back to that fundamentals. Okay, this is the syntax of the loop. This tells you where to start. This tells you where to stop. That less than is there is important. And guess what? I can change that to less than or equal to. Okay, it's doable. I can change that to greater than or equal to. That's doable. Fixing those problems. Now, let's look at how this actually plays out if you're using a different language. Let's switch over here to Python. Good old Python. All right. So in Python, what I'll do is I will tell it to run. I'm going to tell it to run just this. I'm going to go run. I'm going to run just the selected lines. Now, in Python, what it does is it comes over to the console, and the console says, hey, here's what we did. Okay, I have the start. I have the stop. I have the age just the same. The syntax is a little bit different. Notice. For I in range, start, stop. Now, I could have put a 1 there, comma 1. It would have still worked the exact same way, but it's implied. The default value is 1. And then I print out I and the A of I. And if you look at this, it's pretty much exactly the same as what you saw in JavaScript. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's A through E. JavaScript console did show you that they were strings by putting them in the parentheses, but you can kind of figure that out here too. In the quotes, I don't need them in the quotes. I can see what happened, and yeah, it's the same thing. Note, Python uses a different syntax than JavaScript uses a different, the syntax of JavaScript is pretty similar to C#, which I use a lot. So the languages are similar, but not exact. Now, I can do this. I can come over here. Now, actually, since I have defined these variables in the console, they're going to just simply get reused. So now if I go ahead and run this, and I run just what I selected, it's going to go, oops, list index out of range. That's what we expected to happen. Because if you think back to the JavaScript, it started at stop, which was, by the way, 5. A of 5 doesn't exist. It goes 0 through 4. Okay, now the syntax is correct in the range. It says stop, start, and -1. It wants to decrement. It's going to want to go down. It starts at the highest number. It goes to the lowest number. But the highest number, 5, doesn't exist there. So, well, what could I do there? Well, one thing that I could do is I could come over here, and this is just a way to deal with this. Okay, I'm going to show you 2 ways to deal with this. I can go I minus 1 and A of I minus 1 because I know that I really don't want to start the decrementing at 5 because 5 doesn't exist. And if I go ahead and run this set of cells, well, now it seemed to work fine. I've got 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. A, E, D, C, B, A. It decremented okay there. Or what else could I possibly have done? Well, I could potentially do this. I could say start at stop -1, which would start it at 4. So let's run that and see what happens. Okay, and it's going to be good, but except for one thing. If you notice down here in the console, wait just a second. What happened to my A of 0? Well, I told it to go to start, but remember the JavaScript example. It didn't actually run it for the value of the second one. It stopped it before it got there. Well, that's actually just a construct of how it works. It is decrementing down by -1, and when it gets to where it is, it says, I'm done, okay, because I've gotten to the start variable, but it doesn't actually put that into the loop. Well, how do I fix that? Okay, well, okay, see, now it's getting even more complex. Well, I could say I can run it to start -1. Okay, well, that'll work. Okay, I'm going to stop here because it's time for you to program and play with this and look at this. There's documentation, but how do you actually learn how these things work? Run them. Try them. Also, look at this range thing. Look at how it works. There's documentation for loops and the range variables. I recommend, what's the best way to learn to program? To program. It's that simple. Do it. Try it. See what happens. This is, you're not breaking anything. You've got a console log. Now, a little bit of housekeeping right here. Over here in my JavaScript example, I was using JS Fiddle. JS Fiddle is a great tool. Lets you play with JavaScript. It's completely free. You can go online, create an account, and do JS fiddling, writing JavaScript all you want. Okay, over here, housekeeping. I am using Spider. I'm using Python 3.8. It's the latest version of Python right now. It might not be the latest version of Python when you're using this, but the reality of it is that Python probably isn't going to go ahead and just totally revamp their looping mechanism between the time you watch this and later on. This is meant to be a fundamental video of understanding how these loops work, but the Spider tool is built into the Anaconda distribution of Python. Reality is that this is just a text editor that's designed to make writing Python easy, and Spider is fun to use because it's got all these little tools that go with it, and you can see the console right there on the right-hand side of what you're doing, and pretty great stuff. So I promised to get this done within 15 minutes, and I'm going to make it by about 5 seconds. Good programming. hopefully this is useful.